consecutive hours of being on duty, then they're supposed to take a 30-minute break. That's the current rule, and that break must be off duty or in the sleeper berth. That's the current rule. So the new rule states, and to be honest with you, when we first heard this when I was with FMCSA, we thought it was actually driving anyway. That's the way we were investigating carriers. So now the new rule says that the break needed to be before driving a CMV, after already driving of 8 hours. So the new old rule was coming on duty, starting your workday. Once you hit 8 hours of being on duty, which that would include driving, and once you hit 8 hours, you have to take that 30-minute break in the off-duty line or in the sleeper berth. The new rule states that once you get 8 hours of driving, then you must take that 30-minute break, and now you can take it in the on-duty not driving, which is line 4, or line 1 off-duty, or line 2 sleeper berth. That's going to bring up a lot of issues. I've already gotten a lot of calls like, well, how do we know if they're on duty not driving and they're loading and unloading, which they've been doing it already. But just keep in mind, that's what the new rule says. It's 8 hours of driving, and now they have an additional way to take that on the on-duty not driving, which should be line 4. Any questions there? I mean, y'all can chime in at any time, okay? All right. So let's look at this quick example. So as we can look in this example, we can see that the driver has been on duty, came on duty at 5 a.m. in the morning. He has, at 1 o'clock, decided to take a 30-minute break. Once again, under the old rule, he would have to take a 30-minute break off duty. Everybody see that? At 1 o'clock, under the old rule, he would have to take an off-duty 30-minute break. Now, under the new rule, the break would be needed just before the driver begins to start driving at 3 o'clock p.m. And now he can take that 30-minute break in the on-duty not driving line, which is line 4. Does that make sense? Pretty self-explanatory. It's going to be one of those ones that's going to be hard to catch for some people, especially with ELDs. Now, this was a paper log version, but I'm quite sure, depending on what system you got, it'll probably pick it up as a violation. All right. So 30-minute breaks, how does it impact? No need to stop work activities, such as like loading and unloading. So now I'm going back to my former driver days. I could be sitting in the break room, or I could be out. You know, it's going to be kind of one of those things where the driver needs to annotate that, okay, I'm doing my 30-minute break, and he could be on the loading dock. He or she could be on the loading dock. Vehicle inspections, they could be doing paperwork, other work activities. So now all of that, when they're at a distribution center, at a consignee or shipper, they can have that on duty not driving because they're waiting to be loaded, waiting to be unloaded, and taking their 30-minute break. So I always try to tell drivers, you know, it's not required that you say what you do. You're only required to put city and state, but it's going to help that roadside officer to know what you're doing when you show 2 hours or an hour at on duty not driving in a specific location. The off duty and sleeper berth rest is still the ideal thing, because guess what? They still want the driver to rest. I'll just speak for me, and what I'm seeing already with the current rule we have is already kind of being abused. But however, they want the driver to get the rest break that they need to have so they can operate that vehicle without becoming fatigued. It only applies to those drivers who operate CMVs for 8 hours. So if a driver comes on duty, and let's just say he came on duty and only spent 5 hours that day between driving and being on duty, they're not subject to taking that 30-minute break. That's pretty self-explanatory. More drivers will be exempt from breaks, especially your short haul guys, but these older road guys or regional guys, this is going to probably be applicable to them a lot. And then the violations are common today, but they should decrease. It's one of the most cited violations in Part 395 is that 30-minute break. Okay. Short haul exemption or exception. So the current rule is all work done within 12 consecutive hours. must remain in a 100 air mile radius, and I'll break down the radiuses a little bit later on another slide. That's the current rule. So they have to stay in a 100 air mile radius. What most folks get confused is they say, well, I can only drive 100 miles in a day or in a 12-hour period. No, as long as you stay within a 100 air mile radius, you might can drive 300 miles. It just depends on how many hours you have. So under the new rule, now they go from a 12-hour day to a 14-hour day. They go from a 12-hour day to a 14-hour day, and now they must remain within a 150 air mile radius. And again, I will break down the radiuses in a later slide. So we go from a 12 to a 14-hour day, from 100 air mile radius to 150 air miles. So that's going to be pushing it out there. That should help a lot of the short haul guys with, some people, the biggest question I'll get is, well, do I still have to run a logbook, or what do I need to have if I'm crossing state lines? If I'm in, give me a close, if I'm in Florence and I've crossed over into North Carolina, am I still required to have a log? We'll talk a little bit about that later. But as long as they stay within that 150 air mile radius, they can still stay on a timesheet. They can use paper log, but, or an ELD, but they're only required to have time records. Quick recap, must remain within the radius. When you see that 10 and 8, that's for your passenger carriers. So of course, we are property carriers. Most of us on this call, all of us, we can still only drive a max of 11 hours. We can only drive a max of 11 hours. Some states have an intrastate rule. I'll try to stay away from that right now, but for regional OTR guys, we're gonna look at it as 11 hours of driving max. Remember, when you do this short haul exemption, the driver have to start and end at their regular normal work reporting location. They have to do that. And they must be done or off duty within 12 consecutive hours. This is just a recap. And then they must have 10 hours off between shifts. It's up to the motor carrier to determine if they're gonna stay on the 60 or the 70-hour limit. Most of these drivers stay on the 60-hour because they're probably only working Monday through Friday, but it's up to you to determine. So most of the audits that I've sat on and most of the audits that I've done, that's one of the first questions I ask. What ruling are you using, 60 or 70? So it's up to you to tell them what you're going to use. I always say, why not just go ahead and use the 70? I'd rather have it and need it than need it and not have it, okay? Keep time records instead of logs. Again, I have some of my clients, they'll use a paper log. Some of them actually use ELDs and just set the parameters up in the ELD, but the driver is only required to have time records. There's an interpretation question in Part 395 that says that what does the driver need to have on them while they're on the road? The answer is none. They don't have to carry the time records on them in the vehicle, but they must have them at the principal place of business upon state auditor or federal auditor requesting them. Only thing that needs to be on that time record is the start and end time and total hours. Start, end time, and total hours. You got to keep them from 6 months. No 30-minute breaks are required when you're under the short haul exemption. No need to keep supporting documents. I put that in there, but best practices, I mean, if I was auditing and, they're going to ask, do you have any supporting documents? But it's going to be hard to, what they're looking for is times and locations to check for falsification. It's going to be very difficult for them to, get falsification on a time record. Unless the driver says they're off and then they have a supporting document that says Darren worked that day. He was in Florida or wherever, okay? So I would maintain supporting documents, but they're not required when you're under the short haul exemption. All right, so I told you, I promised I'd break out the air mile radius because we're not driving airplanes. Although some of the trucks I see are moving pretty fast like airplanes. But when you look at this 100 air mile, it's equivalent to 115 statute miles. 115 statute miles. So now that we got 150 air miles, it's 172.6. So if you go 173, I mean, you got to have a real meaty auditor or roadside guy that they'll probably give you the grace for 173. But remember that 150 air miles is equivalent to 172.6 statute miles. All right. More than double the geographical area. So now they probably get out a little bit more. I say you can probably get up to some good, you can probably cover some geographical area now with this 150 air miles, okay? It adds 2 hours to the day. I don't know why you want to spend more time with your customers. Most of the drivers want to get in and get out, but it can respond to some of the market changes. Some of the things that drivers have been saying, I'm sitting here waiting and, it's taking up all my time because I got to sit here and wait for them to pull out 1 or 2 pallets. So now they got a little bit more time to do what they need to do. This goal may be a little bit tougher for enforcement, but most of the time if they see a driver pulling a day cab, they already know they're probably short haul guys. When I was out there on the road, I like to stop those guys because most of the time you'd be surprised what you find. It's still a benefit to using ELDs. Again, it's the only thing you're required to have is time records. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. It's still no change to the guys who have non-CDLs. I won't bore you with this. They still can hold a CDL. They must stay within 150 air miles. Same thing. You got to return to the base each day. So pretty much really no change there for non-CDL guys who stay in the short haul operation. Just let you take a minute, look at that slide. Okay. Sleeper berth. Oh my goodness. I'm going to do my best not to confuse myself. I always tell drivers, stay away from this. But again, you're going to have drivers who figure, I know the rules, I can get around it. But then when they get stopped, they can't explain it. So the current rule says that they must spend at least 8 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth, plus another break of 2 hours to get the 10. Shorter breaks count against the 14-hour, the 2-hour break, maybe riding in the vehicle after 8 in the sleeper berth. That's the current rule. That's the 8-2 or the 2 and 8 split. Bruce, I hope you'll be proud of me if I can explain this correctly. So the new rule says that you must spend at least 7 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth, plus another 2 hours to get the 10. Did I do that right? It should be 7 and 3. Well, 2+ hours, so that'd give you 3. So you got to have 7 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth, plus take another break of 2+ hours. So to get the 10. So 7 plus 3 and anything more will give you the 10. Neither break counts against the 14-hour limit. That's the huge difference. All before under the old rule, it would count in that 14. It's kind of like what the passenger carriers are doing now. Once they get to their locations, such as the zoo, once they get there and they go off duty, the time clock stops. Now you're going to have to not count this 7 and 2 or the 8 and 2 in that 14-hour. And then lastly, under the new rule, 3-hour break may be riding in the vehicle after the 7th in the sleeper. I'll show you a little bit of example. I know that was a lot. Okay, it's like reading the Old Testament here. So let me show you an example. All right, I'm gonna so I see some of y'all, I see Richard, you're writing, so I'll let you kind of write that down if you want to. Maybe Taryn or
Darren, can the 3-hour break be off duty instead of sleeper berth?
It has to be in the sleeper. And the reason being from my reading is because it's the split sleeper berth. Now, if I'm missing something, somebody chimes in, but I believe it has to be in the sleeper berth because you're doing a split sleeper berth provision. Unmute, Taryn.
Sorry, I'm sure that we'll get more specific guidance on this as they work through it. I was actually just pulling that section up.
Yeah, I was looking here because I know when we had the 8 and 2, it always had to be, you got to have them in the sleeper berth. That's why it's called a sleeper berth provision. But again, you have some more guidance. What you got, Taryn?
Well, I was just going to say, the 3, even though it's considered sleeper berth, as you see down there on the end, is, riding in the vehicle, etc. So it's just not going to count against you. I do, even TCA is like, this is huge for us, and it gives us more flexibility. Their whole push is just to get the whole 10 or 11 hours as you can do whatever you want to do in that break and not be restricted. But this is a step, I think, in the right direction and gives us more flexibility. And I love the fact that it's not taken away from your 14-hour limit. That's going to be huge, especially for moving freight. It's going to change all of your patterns all over again in your routing.
And one of the things, Dennis, too, I'll say is when we're trying to get 10 consecutive hours off without using the sleeper berth provision, I think as long as you use like 5 in the sleeper consecutive and do 5 in off duty, then you can get the off duty in there when you're getting the 10 consecutive. But I believe when you're using the split sleeper berth, all your rest breaks have to be in that sleeper. But we'll get more information on that just so I can make sure that I'm providing you with the correct information.
I will say too, of note, yesterday while we were on that call, Darren, you probably noticed this as well. There were several EDL providers, ELD providers on the call, and who they're trying to work through the minutia of this to make sure that whatever changes they make to your systems are going to be flexible and compatible. Of course, part of that is going to be forced, but they're also going to do it just because they're trying to make your lives easier. They seemed excited though.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, let me see if I can give you a good example of this. Okay, here's what the current rule looks like. So from 1 a.m. to 3 p.m. is 14 hours. Notice within the driver's 14 hours, he takes 2 hours off in the sleeper berth. And I guess, Dennis, here's your question. So in this example, I guess you can use the off-duty box. So he took 2 hours off in off-duty within his 14. So once his 14-hour day ended at 3 o'clock p.m., the driver only had to take 8 consecutive hours off in the sleeper berth. So when he gets done after his 8 hours, and I'm just assuming it says 6 hours available to drive in an 8.7-hour window. I don't see the next day, but just looking at this current day, he has his 2 and 8 is what we're talking about, split sleeper berth. He has 2 hours off within the 14, is off duty, and then once his 14-hour day ended at 3 p.m., he took 8 consecutive hours off. Make sense? Okay, that's the current rule. Here's where it's gonna get a little tricky. Now, I had to look at this probably 2 or 3 times and almost started to go back and check my laser vision surgery. So let's look at this one. Here's the new rule. So as you can see, the driver came on at 1 a.m. and went off duty at 8 a.m. So he has 6 hours, 6 hours of driving, and that's 7 hours total being on duty with, with his driving time. He or she goes off duty from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. That time doesn't count within the 14-hour limit because it's off duty. That's the 3 hours that he's going to use with the 7. Remember, 2+ hours to get his 10, okay? Then he comes back on, he or she comes back on duty at 11 a.m. and then, trucks along, takes him off duty time at 3, and then the 14-hour reaches at 6 p.m. So from 11 to 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. was the other 7. So 7 and 7, that's his 14-hour day. But notice they did not count those 3 hours off duty from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. So it looks like you can use the off duty with this split sleeper berth. Does that make sense? Questions? Can you imagine trying to do this on an ELD at the roadside, trying to do an audit? Or even in a company, this is going to be tough getting some used to from an auditing standpoint. I think with the ELD system, with the parameters set correctly by the ELD provider, it should be fairly simple.
Too bad nobody has access to E-rods except for enforcement. Might make everybody's life easier.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I can see a driver. I don't know how this would help unless you're going around major cities. Is when I used it when I was driving, Atlanta, traffic-wise, waiting till the traffic die down and then trying to go into Atlanta. Indianapolis, these big cities. When you're trying to wait for traffic, I think this is going to help. but I can see drivers trying to use this and saying, hey, look, I was on duty, not driving for 3 hours, and now they're trying to do the split sleeper berth and they can't do that. All right, moving on. So remember the options to get your rest breaks are, remember, 10 consecutive hours off, 10 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth, or you can use the 10 hours combo. But like I said earlier, 5 in the sleeper, 5 off duty, but it has to be consecutive. 2 qualifying rest breaks to reach the 10, which we just went through that. I won't bore you with that again, but remember, they still cannot drive no more than 11 hours of driving and no more than 14 hours of being on duty. So they still got a 14-hour day, only 11 hours of driving. Okay. Again, more flexibility to rest and split the 10-hour rest breaks. No loss of productivity time due to the 2+ hours rest breaks. Drivers will have more options of ways to, to get rest by using the split sleeper berth. Remember, a 3-hour break does not extend to 14-hour unless combo with the 7+ and the sleeper. Okay, we talked about that already. So I think if it's used properly, they'll get a better options to help them get rest. Okay. Adverse condition. All right. So under the current rule, may not extend the driving limit, but not the on-duty limit by 2 hours. I don't know if you all remember when we had that big ice storm. I think it was maybe about 2 or 3 years now. And we had ice on palm trees in Charleston and all that kind of stuff. And everybody, I was on 95 trying to work my way out of Savannah. So these adverse conditions may vary. I mean, at that time, we had drivers on the road stuck 5 and 6 hours behind. I mean, they couldn't move because ice was literally on the road. So under this current rule, may not extend the driving limit, but not the on-duty limit by 2 hours. For truck drivers, 13 hours of driving in a 14-hour period. So it does not extend the on-duty time, but does give them 2 hours of drive to get to a safe haven or complete that trip within those 2 hours. Now, under the new rule, I got y'all. Go back, I'm sorry. Under the new rule, it may extend both the driving and the on-duty by 2 hours. That's the difference. So now the driver can drive up to 13 hours in a 16-hour period. So both of them will be extended. I'm not reading the bottom one because that's for bus drivers. So now they'll be able to drive up to 13 hours in a 16-hour period for an adverse condition. Make sense? All right. So here's the key to this, because I get asked all the time. They say, what's an adverse condition in Greenville around, what's that, 385 every day? There's an adverse condition in Atlanta every day. But remember, the definition of an adverse condition pretty much is, it means snow, sleet, ice, fog, or any other major accidents or something that shuts down the road that the driver didn't know about, the dispatch didn't know, or could have reasonably known about. So, if we know it's going to be traffic in these major areas, then guess what? That's trip planning. But adverse condition, this is something we didn't know about. Now, I have been in a situation in an audit where the investigator said, well, your EOD system provided you with weather. I mean, it literally did all the way up the path. And we were showing that so we could explain why the driver took him longer to get from one point to the next point. But just remember, this is something that we did not know before the driver began to start driving. So that's what the adverse condition definition is. Right. So example here, as you can see, the driver hit the 14-hour at 2 o'clock. He came on at 1 a.m. So 2 o'clock p.m. was his 14 hours. He had already driven a little over 11 hours, hit an adverse condition. Remember, I always tell everybody, especially when I do these mock audits or even when I'm doing consulting, the driver needs to annotate, 2-hour delay traffic accident, 2-hour delay, major fog, major ice storm. I mean, it can happen, especially when you're up in the mountains. I mean, I've driven out west, driven on the East Coast, and all of a sudden, bam, you're in the middle going through the gorge and you got snow coming down on top. Wasn't on my radar map. So just remember, it gives that driver now 2 additional hours and 2 additional hours of being on duty to try to get to a safe haven or get to the constantly or back to the terminal yard. But I cannot go and dispatch a driver under the adverse conditions. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, again, the impact is it gives the drivers more eligibility to take advantage of this 2-hour extension of the duty day and driving time. More drivers will be able to wait out unexpected weather or conditions on the on-duty or off-duty line. Still restricted for unforeseen events, does not exempt the driver from the 30-minute break. So now you may end up having to take what? An additional 30-minute break. So we got to be very mindful of this. And I'll tell you right now, with some of the ELD systems that I've seen, and maybe it was during the AOBRD days, but please make sure that your system has an adverse condition option, okay? Questions, comments? Next steps.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Drivers stopped in the accident ahead. Accident was moving, but it took them, half hour. So stop and go half hour to hour additional to get through that. How do you calculate that? How much extra time they can drive?
If it's now under this new rule, they'll have up to additional 2 hours of driving. You saying if it's like stop and go, or they just sitting still for about an hour and a half?
Yeah, so it's less than 2 hours. That's actually delaying them.
Yeah.
So are they allowed to take 2 hours, even though it only took them maybe half hour additional time because it was slow traffic going through the crash site?
Yeah, I already see the gray areas in this. So if they already at 10 hours and they say, well, it was an adverse condition that held me up, I could have made it to the distribution center. I still got an hour in my 11. I would just go ahead and play it safe and take that hour and get to where they need to get, offload or get to the terminal. And then if it comes up to the point where if let's say they're going to a consignee or a shipper and the ship says, well, you can't stay here, you got to move off the property, then that's when I'm gonna hit personal conveyance and put a note in there and say, hey, look, consignee said, customer said I couldn't stay on the property. I use personal conveyance to get to the next safe haven. Am I answering your question properly?
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
Is this going to have any change on the current 16-hour short haul exemption?
I didn't see anything about the 16-hour rule exemption. As far as I know, it's going to stay the same. That may be something I may need to look into, but it wasn't anything that I read in that long dissertation as of yet about the 16-hour rule. I didn't see any changes to that. To me, when I look at that 16-hour rule exemption and the an adverse condition, it's the same, except adverse condition is something that you did not see or didn't know before that vehicle was dispatched. But I hadn't seen any changes. I'll make a note of that to make sure if there's anything in the upcoming webinars or questions that should have been a question asked yesterday with the FMCSA. I was on the call with them. So I'll run that up the chain and see if we can get. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So remember, training will be the key. It's always good, training. I always tell, folks that, drivers are already going to be in the truck stop talking. I call it truck stop talk. Make sure that they, get the proper training. Make sure that they're adhering to your company policies and the rules and regulations from the FMCSA, not what they heard out in the street. Dispatchers have to be trained. Safety managers, drivers, everybody have to be trained. So remember, these changes will impact pretty much the whole entire industry, or people who use these rules. Company expectations. We already talked about rumors. Weigh in operational benefits of keeping ELDs for short haul guys. I know a lot of the short haul guys, especially in the intermodal world, they don't like it. They like to be on their paper and their time sheets, but weigh those weigh those options. It may be better to put them on an ELD to keep track of things. Update your policies and procedures. Remember, I don't like the word policy. I like procedures because I may have to change those procedures depending upon what's going on. But some of you may already know your operation, so you can go and say, okay, this is what the policy is going to be. But from my investigation days, remember, if you're going to write a policy, make sure that you're doing that policy. Make sure you're adhering to that policy. And then again, the whole big goal is to keep everybody safe. Fatigue prevention remains a critical concern. That's what it's all about, keeping everybody safe and preventing fatigue. Any questions or comments? That's just what we have at the moment. Any other questions?
Tyler, will we have access to the PowerPoints?
I think Taryn is going to make you guys access to it. She'll probably email them out.
Yeah, I'll send those out after this. And I did record this. I'm probably not going to post this so that it's open and out for everybody. But if you want to re-listen to it or share it with somebody, go for it. Just going to send it to the Safety Council. And then, as we get more details, we will, get those sent out to you. The first detail we have to wait on is the posting in the Federal Register. So that'll actually determine the effective date.
Taryn, did you get it? I made a note about the 16-hour rule. How would this play a part in that? So I don't see where it would, but we can run that up through the feds and ask them, FMCSA.
Yeah, I actually got interrupted by the kids at that second. So I needed more details on the question so that we could research it.
Okay.
Who asked that question?
I didn't even think to ask who asked the question.
Robert Schlotman.
Oh, Robert, can you email that question to me so I have it in writing?
Oh, well, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions, concerns about anything else?
Do you think this is going to help you? And then on the flip side, what do you foresee are, as some of the potential pitfalls? Have you thought about it at all? Do you have any feedback?
I don't think it's going to affect us much over here at our operations. I'm pretty sure we probably have drivers putting their lunch break in while they're getting loaded and unloaded, which we try to police that. But I don't, here at Cooper, I don't think it's going to affect us much at all in our operations. Our local guys already are on ELD every day, so I don't see causing the issue. I think we're just going to continue the way we're doing it. And once the changes take effect in OmniTracks, which we use, I think we'll be all right.
I'm personally a little curious about how many of those that are going from the 100 air mile radius to the 150. Anybody over the 100, even if you were completely intrastate, still had to comply with the ELDs. So how many of them are going to be a little frustrated? They're like, I just invested all of this money and now I don't need it because I was only going 120, Yeah. So I'm waiting for those phone calls.
Yeah. They'll be wanting a refund, but you never know. When they get to 150, they may try to jump over the line, You got it if you need it,
And from an enforcement standpoint, I think it's interesting too, because all of the officers, they have their territories. They know like where the start and end points are. They know which carriers are fudging, and now they're going to have to relearn all of that.
I think my biggest concern is remarks. Not too many remarks. I always have to clarify what remarks are. Some drivers say, "Well, I had to go to the bathroom. I had to go pee-pee. I had to go boo." We don't need to know that. Just if you're gonna be on duty, not driving for a long time, just take about 30-minute break, PTI, unload, load the simple things. That just helps that inspector out on the side of the road. versus trying to interview that driver, which I used to love to do, because when you start interviewing, they start coming up with all kinds of things. So just keep that in mind.
What else you got? Outside hours. Somebody's got me on an echo.